Welcome to the Wilson Center. I think we're likely to have others join us, but we're going to go ahead and get started since our time is limited. I'm Bob Hathaway. I direct the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. I want to acknowledge on my left Hollis Fondiare, who directs the Middle East program, also here at the Wilson Center, and our two programs, Asia and Middle East, are co-conspirators in hosting this program this morning. Since we have an audience beyond those in this room, permit me just to say a couple of words about the Woodrow Wilson Center for those, some of you who may not be in Washington and may not know who or what we are. The Wilson Center is one of Washington's leading independent, nonpartisan institutes for advanced study and research. We were created by the U.S. Congress back in the 1960s as the nation's official memorial to President Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, as some of you undoubtedly know, was a very prominent scholar prior to becoming a university president, prior to becoming New Jersey governor, prior to becoming President of the United States. And the Wilson Center commemorates both the scholarly depth and the public policy concerns of President Wilson. Our event this morning is an example of both of those concerns and an example of what we do here at the Wilson Center. To get us started and as a way of introduction of our speaker, permit me simply to read the lead sentence in a story that appeared several months ago in the Boston Globe, datelined Kandahar, Afghanistan. In a city where women are rarely seen, never mind heard, Sarah Jays talks tough politics with rough men, drives her own car, and keeps a gun under her bed. I can't say that that accurately describes all our speakers that we have here. So when we had the opportunity to host this event, it was a no-brainer for us. And Sarah, we're delighted to have you here. Those of you who are in the room picked up biographies of Sarah, and so I don't want to tell you what you already know, but again, because we're also talking to a C-SPAN audience and to a webcast audience, I'll say just a couple of highlights about Sarah. She entered Afghanistan late in 2001 as a correspondent for National Public Radio, having had a distinguished and prize-winning career with NPR. And she'll tell the story, but I gather that she fell in love with Afghanistan and with the people of Afghanistan and was moved by the needs of Afghanistan, and so the following year decided to leave journalism, leave NPR, and stay in Afghanistan to work as a private citizen. And I think that she will relate these experiences to us today. The occasion for her appearance here at the Wilson Center, and indeed her appearance in America as opposed to Afghanistan, is related to the publication of her first book, The Punishment of Virtue, also an eye-catching title. We have a bookseller on her way, and there will be an opportunity for you to purchase copies of this book immediately outside the door upon the conclusion of our event. Sarah, people didn't come to hear me talk, so I'm going to turn things over to you now, but welcome to the Wilson Center.
Thank you so much, and it really is an honor, and in honor of you, who are an extraordinarily gifted and high-level audience, I would like to keep what I have to say to a minimum, because what I really want to do is turn this into a conversation as quickly as possible. But I think I'll actually bounce off of one thing that you said, Bob, which is that I fell in love with Afghanistan, which is true. And it's a complex love affair. It's not a starry-eyed love affair. It's But that's actually not quite the reason that I decided to stay behind. And it was really a stunning moment when I made that decision, which was I was leaving, I had finished my NPR rotation and was having dinner with President Karzai's uncle, who had been one of my really precious behind-the-scenes kind of cultural sources. And we had a wonderful dinner, and we were talking about what's going to happen next, and he's talking about the free-for-all that he knew was going to take place as money, was going to move into the country, and how everyone would be sharpening their teeth and their knives, And I got up to leave, and he said, "Wouldn't you come back and help us? How do you say no to that one?" And the reason had really more to do with what I felt to be the incredible strategic conjuncture that Afghanistan represented. And I know that we've all been thinking about in various ways the issue of clash of civilizations and this supposedly irrevocable divide that is opening up between what is called Islam, if there were such a thing, and what is called the West, if there were such a thing. And I actually believe that the combat of our time is a different combat. It's a combat between the people on both sides of that alleged divide who believe in it, and the people, and I assume that many of us are on the other side, the people who don't believe in that kind of thinking. And it seemed to me that Kandahar, Afghanistan, was a really important place to try, in whatever way I could, to fight against that way of seeing the world. And I really do believe that this is the equivalent for our generation of what the Spanish Civil War was in the 1930s. I think this is really the combat that it's worth taking risks for. So having said that, I don't want to drone on for too long. I'd like to put out a kind of an issue with some illustrations that I think has led to a lot of the problems in Afghanistan, not to mention Iraq and other places that we've all been concerned about recently. Let me back up another second and say that my experience in Afghanistan, as described in this book, has been a really unique one, because what happened was Uncle Aziz Karzai hands me off to President Karzai's older brother, Qayyum, and I worked for him for 2.5 years. We basically set up, he had a non-governmental organization which existed in status but not in action. And so I set it up in Kandahar, and working closely with Qayyum Karzai meant that I had a level of access to officials both in both in the Afghan and the American government that was totally out of proportion to what we were as a NGO and who I was. And secondly, because neither Qayyum nor myself nor my older sister, whom I roped into this venture also, none of us were part of the kind of humanitarian industry, biz. So we were not constrained by all of these barriers that are now being set up by that industry. So we didn't realize that you're not supposed to do reconstruction and policy. We didn't understand that you're not supposed to straddle those lines. In fact, it was our view that that actually by working concretely on the ground, you got a real understanding of what the policy issues were. It makes a big difference when you're rebuilding a village and the warlord holds up your tractor at gunpoint and says, you can't have any of those stones because I have a monopoly on those stones. You have a whole different feeling about what warlordism is when you're on the other end of the gun. And so our action was very idiosyncratic. So all of that by way of background. The issue I wanted to kind of put on the table here is what I've seen as a kind of distinction, which I fear is an artificial distinction between security and governance. And what I had been hearing in Afghanistan over the last 5 years is, oh, well, we'll worry about governance later. Let's stabilize the situation, and we'll use whoever we have to hand, meaning these warlord strongmen, essentially, because they have militias and they're armed and they can keep a lid on things. And what I started saying in late 2002, when I end up being on the other side of some of these warlords' gunmen, is, you know what? These people are creating instability. And not only are they creating instability, but they are really severely disillusioning the Afghan public. And again, I can only speak for my region, which is the South, and the people that I know, but I can honestly tell you that there was a genuine upsurge in hope and inspiration and energy and enthusiasm for about the first 6 months of this whole experiment. And what Kandaharis looked to us for, I don't even want to use the word democracy because it's become so charged, but they were looking to us to help provide them with a lot of the things that I think we want from our government, like roads, schools, doctors who are qualified, so they're not going to poison patients by bad prescriptions, and some kind of substantive participation in their collective destiny. What they've gotten, I'm afraid to say, is really predatory behavior, more or less from any, wherever they interface with the government. Basically, that point of interface is a chance for the government official to extract money from them, be it in the form of bribes, be it in the form of shakedowns, be it in the form of kidnapping for ransom, you name it. They've gotten roads, but their school teachers are so badly paid that they're not going to class anymore. So, you send children to school and they're being taught by class monitors, in effect. They're getting rigged elections. I mean, fantastically rigged elections, like ballot boxes with all the ballots are written in the same color ink with the same person's name on it and things like that. And that was really interesting to witness. I was in Kandahar last fall when the parliamentary elections took place, and it was really interesting to watch the descent of the media, because we hadn't seen media in Kandahar for ages. And suddenly everyone arrives, and they arrive the day or 2 days before the election, and they leave the day after the election. And I thought, man, at least the American media should have remembered that the important day is not the day that you vote, it's the day that you count, right? And so the whole counting process, which took forever, and was just ludicrously untransparent, happened without any witness to it. And so what you have is a situation, I now run a cooperative where we make soap out of local agricultural products. It's a kind of anti-opium project. And so one of my women came in one day, and she's really wonderful and very expressive and sensitive in the way that she experiences and communicates about how she feels. And she said, we don't know what to do. This is a local expression. We're like a man who's standing on 2 watermelons, 1 foot, on each of 2 watermelons, because the Taliban won't leave us alone. Basically, the Taliban are preying on us at night, and the government is preying on us in the daytime. And that's how people are experiencing it in Kandahar now, is that the Taliban and the government are kind of 2 rival factions who are duking it out, and the people, the ordinary population, is caught in the middle and is not represented by either of these factions. And when I say, I also saw President Karzai right as I was leaving to come on this trip, and he kept asking me, how's so-and-so? And I said, I haven't seen him in a while. How's so-and-so? I haven't seen him. He said, you haven't seen anyone. And I said, frankly, I can't go out my door without seeing an example of brutality perpetrated by a member of your government on one of your citizens, and I can't bear it. And it's things like, a rickshaw stops off to leave that's the 3-wheeled taxi kind of thing, riotously decorated in Kandahar. They're like dung beetles. They're like these, that tootle all around and in and out and through the traffic and everything like that. And there was like a restricted access road that leads to the governor's palace. And so the soldiers don't want people idling for a long time in front of that access road. But he was just dropping off a passenger, and did the soldier say, could you please move along? No. He goes and kicks out the back headlight of the rickshaw. Then the rickshaw drives off, and the soldier runs after it and kicks out the other back light. This is a poor man who drives that rickshaw. He doesn't have a lot of excess cash to repair his lights. Or, for example, the brother of one of the members of my cooperative was hit by a police truck that was passing a car that was passing another car. So he was breaking the law, and my friend was on a motorcycle. So we meet him at the hospital where he had been taken by bystanders, and it turns out the guy had his back broken in 3 places, and we were waiting for him to be x-rayed. And the doctor is like on his cell phone. So how's the kids? Yeah, and Marianne, how's she? And we're like, doctor, could you please take this x-ray? This is a public hospital. So this is, again, how people, and every time something like this happens, people lay that at the feet of the government. And beyond that, they lay that at the feet of the international presence in Afghanistan, because the feeling in Kandahar is that this government is there under the aegis primarily of the United States and of other foreign countries. And what I would say is that the insurgency, or the so-called insurgency that we're seeing now in southern Afghanistan, which is every bit as bad as you're reading about it, I wouldn't actually call it an insurgency, because in spite of everything that I've said, I don't think it's a really genuine indigenous uprising in the way that I think is happening in Iraq. But I would almost phrase it a kind of low-grade invasion, which is being ginned up across the border, primarily in Pakistan, but with some help from some other neighbors. However, it is taking advantage of this disillusionment that people are feeling. When you have somebody say, you know what, the Taliban on one side and the government on the other, and it's 6 of one and half dozen of the other, as far as our interests are concerned, well then, if people are feeling that way, and they're in a village, and 25 or 30 people with guns show up and say, can we sleep in your pomegranate orchard, and would you mind making dinner for us? People are going to do it. They're going to make space for these fighters. And so that's really the situation as I see it now. And what I submit is that it was a very big mistake to say that governance was something that we could think about later. Because in my view, it's the lack of governance which has allowed for the degree of instability that we're seeing now, not to mention the instability created by the lack of governance earlier on in this whole process. And I deeply believe that if the population of southern Afghanistan felt served, respected, and represented by its government, we would not be seeing violence right now. They would just not allow this to happen. So why don't I stop there, and any questions that anybody has about anything, just to bear in mind that I have spent very little time in Kabul and almost no time anywhere else in Afghanistan. So my perspective is really navel-gazing in the south. Do you mind if I grab the questions, or do you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay, I see one right there.
I'm curious what you think of the provincial councils, if they're being effective, and what you thought of the candidates that were on the ballot, and whether you thought that they should be more called. Sorry, so that was the provincial councils.
Right.
And what you think of the candidates that were on the ballot, whether you thought that there should be more of a removal, and what you thought of the balance between the security with that decision.
The question was about the provincial councils, which was one of the positions that was being elected in these elections that I mentioned. So I think you already have a hint as to what my answer will be. I think a poll went out, a Harris poll went out saying something like 55% of Afghans voted in that election. I know how those Harris pollers did their job, because they were doing it in the offices of my former NGO, and they never polled. They filled in their pieces of paper and sent them in. So those numbers are totally based in nothing. And my eyeballing would put it in Kandahar city, where there were no security issues, would put it at 25 to 30%. And people's reasons for voting were really wild, because we founded a radio station, and I continue to mentor some of the reporters. And one of them, who had nothing, his answer to your question, and therefore I would agree with him, is that the reason nobody voted is because the candidates list was so manifestly infected with people who were well-known war criminals, corrupt, and basically inappropriate candidates, that everyone felt that, well, if these people are even on the ballot, then this whole process is not at all what we were given to believe. So my friend had his finger inked, and I said, well, if that's how you feel, how come you voted? Why didn't you He said, it was impossible for me to do my job. If I was going around interviewing people about the election, it would look pretty bad if I didn't, if I didn't have the evidence of having voted. And I was stunned by how non-substantive that reason was. He didn't vote because he believed in the process or because he felt that even the gesture of voting was an act of democracy. It was a totally cosmetic reason to vote. And so I think there had to have been much more culling of those candidate lists, not just for provincial council, but for the national, for the parliament. And the whole, as I say, exercise becomes discredited when people who the Bonn Agreement said ought to have been excluded from the political process were included. And there were several instances, actually, of people being excluded who were put back on the list, unfortunately, by President Karzai in many cases. And so that makes it very difficult when he makes moves like that. It makes it very difficult to say that he doesn't bear some responsibility for the continued empowerment of these people. The result of this is that the provincial councils don't have a whole lot of credibility. And what's happened is they've been, at least in Kandahar, it's been kind of captured by certain power brokers. In the back.
If I can ask you to wait for the microphone, then to identify yourself briefly as well, please.
Alexander Milikishvili, Center for Non-Proliferation Studies of Monterey Institute of International Studies. Thank you very much. I was a bit late for your presentation, but I got the gist of it. I'd like to thank. And I have two questions to you.
Is that allowed? Okay.
I have two questions. One is that you know that by now there was a report by United Nations Office on Drug and Crime that said that the opium production is skyrocketing, and it's at least, by different estimates, 60% more than last year. Most of it is concentrated in south, where you were. And my question has to do with the correlation between the production of opiates and the insurgency.
Yeah.
And the second question, you mentioned that the way you see the nature of insurgency is that it is not necessarily indigenous based. So can you elaborate a little bit more? And in this regard, can you be a little bit more specific and maybe say, is there any...
Name some names?
No, well, is there any involvement on the part of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and what's going on right now? Thank you very much.
On opium, I'm going to assume that once the microphone is used that everyone hears. If they haven't heard the question, holler and I'll repeat it. The first has to do with the interconnection between the opium trade and the insurgency. Again, I emphasize that I'm speaking for Kandahar and not even necessarily for Helmand province, which is immediately to the west of Kandahar and is the opium basket of the country. Here's how I experience that involvement. I don't see the Taliban as fundamentally financing themselves through the opium traffic. What they're doing is finding opportunities. For example, the fighting that really launched the current wave of fighting, particularly in Kandahar province, happened, and I do need this little pointer, and I hope I don't point in anyone's eye. Where is the picture? Why did I lose it? Oh, well, that's the one that I wanted. It says a graveyard in Panjwai. Somebody stand up and hold it up. There we go. Panjwai is immediately to the west and slightly south of Kandahar on the main road that leads to Herat. And what happened there in April is that there was a little skirmish because some Taliban captured a demining car, and then the police came after them and they fought off the police. And then what they did was hand out their business card to the village. And you don't have to stand up there for the rest of the talk holding that picture. Thank you very much. They literally handed out their business card, and they said, you know what, if you guys have any trouble with the government, you call us, because we have 300 fighters between here and thus and such a village in Helmand, and we're raring for a fight. So it was a really strange turning of the tables, that instead of it being the government and the coalition that was hunting the Taliban in caves, it was the Taliban who were hunting the government. And what happened was the villagers figured out that a guy who was posing as a buyer of opium was in fact an informant for the government and was like scoping out fields and then informing on the growers. And so when they figured it out, they called the number on the business card and they told the Taliban, well, here's the problem that we have. And so the Taliban said, okay, make another date with the guy. So they did it. The Taliban catch the guy and then tell him to call the police and call them in the way he always does, which he had to, and that was the first clash that it was in, I think, April, if I remember correctly, that sparked off this whole campaign just to the west of Kandahar. So that's one way, that the Taliban are using the opium issue as a way to further divide the ordinary population from the government. What they're saying is, look, this government is not acting in your material interest because you need this opium to live on and they don't want you to grow it. So that's one thing. The other thing I've started to see in that same region is that the Taliban are starting to act as drivers. And I find it really interesting because that's a relatively risk-free way to get involved in the trade, because they don't have to buy product and then be responsible for selling it, and negotiating the price and things like that. They're just driving it for a fee. And it's easy for them to do that as they start to control roads that lead westward from Kandahar. It's a no-risk venture. They don't have to worry about running into police checkpoints or anything like that. So that's the other thing that I've seen them do. So you have a very ugly triangle, which has, you've got the farmers who are basically trying to make a living. I hate to say it, but I really think that these are the least guilty people in the whole construct. But you've got then the traffickers who are buying opium, and not only do they buy opium, they also provide other services that the government isn't providing, like loans. There's no banking system that functions. As I think most of you know, Afghanistan is a bride price region. Somebody who worked for me, we didn't have enough cash. It'll cost you between $5,000 and $10,000 to get married, which is a whole lot of money for a villager. And we as a cooperative didn't have enough money to front that for one of our cooperative members for him to get married. So he had to borrow from opium dealers. And fortunately, he was not obligated to pay his loan back in opium. It was people that he knew, so he was able to negotiate a cash payback. But most people are obliged to pay back in opium at half the market rate, which amounts to essentially 100% interest loan. But there's no alternative, and so that's how people can structurally get locked into growing opium. There's also been a drought, and that means that a lot of people have had to take land out of production, because land that they could have irrigated using open irrigation channels, they now have to either drill wells, or if wells are already drilled, they're basically paying for water with diesel, with the diesel with which they operate their pumps. So we're working, for example, to propagate solar water pumps, because at least that takes the diesel charge out of the calculations of people. So the triangle is, there's the farmers, there's the opium traffickers who also provide these other services. Also, they go to the farm gate and pick up the crop, so you don't have to transport your crop to market. There are the Taliban who are performing these other functions that I mentioned, protecting to some degree cultivation and providing transport. And then there are the local officials. And the local officials get involved in two major ways. One is to protect fields also for a price. So like if you're a buddy of the governor or another powerful person, you can come across with sometimes a lot of money, several tens of thousands of dollars, to have your opium plantation not get eradicated. And the other thing that local officials do is also provide safe conduct. So the Taliban are driving on routes that they control, and government officials are also providing safe conduct on routes that they can control by appointing lower level officials who are going to go along with the game. And so I know, for example, a former district police chief who captured a convoy, and a call comes in on the satellite phone of one of the traffickers who was driving the convoy, and that call was from a local power broker. And the phone was then in the hands of the police chief, and he was ordered to release the convoy. And he said, I'm not going to do it. And there was a conflict, and he got removed. So that is going on big time, and that's part of the reason why Great Britain and the Dutch basically said, we're not deploying troops if you don't remove the governor of Helmand province and the governor of Uruzgan province. That was a very long-winded answer to that question. The other answer on, I can't answer about Uzbekistan, because what I see happening is a kind of division of labor. So whatever neighbor happens to be near a certain region is the neighbor that basically fronts the so-called insurgency in that region. Where I am, it is head and shoulders Pakistan, and I'm not talking, breakaway groups or anything like that. I'm talking the ISI, and President Musharraf is a former commander-in-chief of the army, and the ISI is a military intelligence agency. I don't believe that this is happening. I don't believe that Musharraf is the, what's the word? Levy. The levy that's holding off this flood. I think that he's playing a very delicate game where he's cultivating it and instrumentalizing it, but hopefully not letting it get so out of hand that he gets himself offed or anything like that. But I definitely think, and I know that Taliban, not Mullah Omar, but the second in command, that ring that's kind of one step down, I've had license plate numbers, and they've been ISI license plates, and I've had safe houses, and, this is not happening in caves. It's happening in Quetta. And so there's a major fiction that's being propagated here. I also am starting to see some participation in that project on the part of Iranian authorities. And that, again, is very counterintuitive to a lot of people who immediately answered that can't be possible. Iran is a Shia country, and these are Sunnis. But there's a lot of strange bedfellows in this situation, mostly because nobody is particularly excited about having a U.S. foothold, a U.S. kind of permanent involvement in this country, and no one is all that interested in having a democratic, healthy, forward-looking Afghanistan either. On the corner there, and then there.
Blair King from the National Democratic Institute. You've argued that too much emphasis has been made on security and stability in the early years, using the warlords. But in the early going, what could have reasonably been done against them? And now, given the situation, what can be done with them?
I see a lot of black and white thinking. And I saw a lot of black and white thinking from day one, which was either you have to give these guys a blank check or you have to remove them. And there's nothing in between. Now, as some of my friends in the room know, I was in favor of removing them. And I still believe that that was possible. I don't think these guys had any kind of base of support. The one thing everybody was thrilled with the Taliban for having done was basically removed the warlords from the body politic. It was like a very painful operation that a cancer patient had to undergo in order to get the tumors taken out of its body. And what we did was take a syringe and inject the cancer right back into the Afghan body politic. I think there were other people around who were not predators, who were better educated, who were locally implanted. I mean, there's a person that I've tried to convince to run for mayor of Kandahar. And I suspect that if he had been offered that job in 2002, he would have taken it. And now he won't. I mean, now he doesn't even want to run because of how bad the situation has gotten. So that's my personal opinion about what ought to have been done. Failing that, I think that it was not necessary to give these warlords a blank check, whereas the guy that I locked horns with was Gulagh Shirzai, who was the governor of Kandahar. And it was unbelievable the degree to which the Americans wrapped themselves up in Gulagh Shirzai. I mean, there was nobody else who had access to the American military, including translators. All of the translators that the American army used to interface with the Afghan population were provided to them by Gulagh Shirzai and his crowd. So that meant that all of southern Afghanistan felt like the American army was basically the private militia of the Barakzai tribe. That's how it came off. And so what I would have done is, if I had made the judgment that there was no way around relying for a certain period of time on these people, I would have ridden herd on them. I would not have written them blank checks. I would have demanded accountability. I would have demanded follow-up. I would have demanded openness to the needs of citizens. Recently, again, I keep telling these stories, but it's hard for me not to, because there's so many examples of this stuff. And I also don't want to come off as though I'm tooting my own horn. What I'm trying to say is this is the kind of activity that I would have expected international officials to engage in. I make soap, so that's a manufactured item. So I decided to start going to the meetings of the Manufacturers Union. We're talking 3-4 months ago, and I find out that they have still not been able to get title to the land in the industrial zone that has been improved with USAID money, and for which there has been a government directive that it has to be sold for 25,000 Afghanis a jarib. It doesn't matter what those units of measure are. And what happened was the provincial authorities said, we don't care what the government says, what the national government says, because this is provincial land, and we're going to come up with our own price. Number one. Number two, they then sit down with the manufacturers and come up with a price of 40,000 Afghanis, almost double per jarib. And the manufacturers say, fine, we'll pay it. And the next morning they hear on the radio that this price doesn't count because the government, it basically wants more money. So the provincial government says, actually, you can use the land for free for a while, and then later we'll decide what the price is going to be. And the manufacturers say, we can't do that. We can't build factories and therefore bring up the value of the land, and then you charge us for the subsequent value of the land. There was that issue, and then there was electricity. There's some good electricity and some bad electricity in Kandahar. And the good electricity was going to the basically the governor's palace and a neighborhood that had been given away to the former governors, this same Gulagh Shirzai's cronies. And you can't run heavy machinery on electricity that's oscillating between 180 and 230 volts. And so basically what happened was I harassed the governor. Again, I have this, for whatever peculiar reason, I have access that most, and it's terrifying, most Afghans don't have. And that's what was very painful to me about this whole event, was that I harassed the governor and I said, you've got to meet with these guys, you've got to solve the electricity problem. And we finally opened his agenda. I literally took his agenda. He says, well, call me tomorrow. And I said, come on, you've got an agenda, let's open the agenda. And tomorrow there was a space from 10 until 5. There was nothing written in. So I said, okay, we get 11 o'clock, okay? And to give him credit, he then calls in the manufacturers, he calls in the head of the electricity department, he calls in the municipal folks. And over the course of another series of meetings for 2 weeks, they actually solved the problem. Moral of the story is that wasn't really my position to do that. That's what I think the international officials, both civilian and lacking civilian, because there weren't very many civilians. There's been one State Department representative in Kandahar, and not even since the beginning, but for the last couple of years, as against 5,000 or 10,000 soldiers. So somebody, I feel, ought to have been holding these people accountable. Again, a very long-winded answer. I think you were next.
Yes, my name is Norma Gatzik, and I'm with the Feminist Majority Foundation. And as you may know, we have been following the issue of the treatment of Afghan women since the U.S. first pulled out. And but I would like to know from you what your perspective is. You know, we're hearing a lot, the burning of schools, all these things, but from your perspective, what is the current situation now for Afghan women?
I'm in Kandahar. Again, what I'm going to tell you is not a very happy picture. What I think we really have to take on board is the degree to which Afghans are frightened. I think Afghans have a reputation for being bloodthirsty, all this stuff, bloodthirsty and unbeatable and all of this stuff, which, they are certainly survivors. They are certain, but what I think we also have to take on board is this is a society suffering from collective post-traumatic stress disorder. And that means that you don't have to kill a vast number of Afghans in order to intimidate a much larger number. So a story that I just told somebody today was, and this was 9 months ago. Just outside Kandahar proper, school guardian was warned and then killed and hung with his turban from the tree in the schoolyard. And pinned to his garment was what we call a night letter, which is one of these threats. And this one had the names of a number of teachers in the school. And it said, you know, you guys better not come back to school because here's what's going to happen. And believe me, that school has not reopened. So what I'm trying to say is that while I found an enormous outpouring of delight at the idea of sending girls to school, even among really traditional families, and while those schools are still open in Kandahar proper, and while the girls dressed in their school uniform of black with a white headscarf, and it's gorgeous, and they're like flocks of starlings or something making their way through town, I have to tell you that families are feeling the pressure, and they don't feel like getting their girls killed, and they don't particularly feel like getting killed themselves. And so this person in front of me is, he was whom I felt to be the most gifted Afghan official that I had met, and he was killed last year. And again, I had to really put pressure, and this was somebody who was really forward-looking and really with the program. And in fact, I talked about his daughters with him before he was killed, months before, and I said, you know, what are you going to do? In particular, one of them was really bright, and he wanted to send her to school in America. He's got a sister here, and that was his plan for her. And I had to, again, pressure his brothers into putting his girls in school. And my women, I says Sarah proprietarily, unfortunately that photo is very dark, so it's hard to see. It's up above the elderly lady. The 4 women in my cooperative, we've got a great environment in this cooperative, knock wood. It's a mixed gender cooperative. I didn't want to do a women's project. I wanted to do something even more revolutionary, which is have women and men working together. And it's there are separate spaces. So the women do have a private space where they can feel at ease, where they can roll up their sleeves. It's not appropriate for women to be seen by men not from their family with their sleeves rolled up. So, you know, and they can speak at ease, you know, but they interact with the men, they cross the men's space. Often they need equipment or materials that they take from the men's space. The men treat them with a lot of respect and collegiality and things like that. There's almost a maternal and filial relationship between them. But lo and behold, it turns out that my women don't tell their neighbors where they work. They do say that they work outside the home, but they say they work as domestic servants, that they bake bread. In fact, one of them said, you know what, my neighbors are really angry that I'm not bringing any bread back to the house, because that's what I've told them I do. So it's not great. No one would dream of going out without a burqa except either women of the age, and usually widows, of that lady. She's a village woman, so it's a little bit easier in villages also. But what you are starting to see is that the Shia community is dressing not in the blue burqa. They're dressing in black, but still with a basically face covered. Not quite, but almost. And you hear a lot of opposition to that on the part of women who say, this is not Sharia. Sharia, you don't have to cover your face in Sharia. This is something else, but we're subject to it. In the back, standing up, and then right in front of you, the lady in white, in a white jacket.
My friend didn't.
Speak loudly or wait for the microphone, and introduce yourself if you would be so kind.
My name is Scott, and I just got a job with something called Integrity Watch Afghanistan, actually. And my friend had told me he sent something from Kabul last week that talked about the 3 Iranian nationals that were found in Kandahar. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that, and if so, who are these nationals? Are these Baluchis? They were accused of supporting the Taliban. But all I have is this blurb that apparently has gotten the expats talking a lot in Afghanistan, but I haven't been able to find it on other news sources.
I don't know anything. I've been out of the country for about 2 or 3 weeks, so I'm not quite in the loop. However, I would say that I have been seeing evidence of Iranian involvement in this so-called insurgency, particularly in the weaponry. That's where people that I know are beginning to raise this issue. And then there was a woman in a jacket. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Farida Azizi. I'm from Afghanistan, and
Salam
I
alaikum.
agree. Walaikum salam. I agree and support your views regarding Afghanistan. I have been in Afghanistan during the Taliban, working village to village, everywhere. And now I'm working with the Zebo magazine, and we would like to also feature you in our next issue if you want. And my question is about the women representation in Afghanistan and the Ulisi Jirga and the Mishranu Jirga. As you said, that 25% of women will occupy. It's just occupying the seats, or you see the real representation of women there?
That's a slightly difficult question for me, because from the perspective of Kandahar, what happens in Kabul almost doesn't make any difference. It's almost like it's a kind of movie being projected on a very distant screen. It doesn't have any impact on us at all. What I can say is that unfortunately in the Kandahar delegation, the vote rigging that I mentioned earlier was happening in full force in the women's representation also. And there was a woman that, she was ahead, and suddenly when the vote count was announced, and there was another woman who was not very ahead and who has not a very good reputation. I've also worked with her in the past, and I have not been wild about her, and I've not been wild about her methods. And a friend of mine interviewed her during the counting process, and she was basically swaggering around saying, don't worry, zmakar samdi, my work is fine. And lo and behold, she won. She was on the top of the 5 who were elected. So that already, again, what I would say is everything that discredited the male side of the register also discredited the female representatives, but probably not more. On the other hand, what I can also say is that during the period, in particular of questions to ministers, I'm really speaking from my own perspective, which is when I occasionally caught some of, it was broadcast. These were basically the parliament, the ministers had to show up in front of parliament and be asked questions about their performance by members of parliament. It was invariably the women who were asking the tough questions. And this was something that I experienced. I did a focus group study of the first Loya Jirga. And in that study, I discovered that the women delegates to the first Loya Jirga were much less intimidated by the kind of supposed gun-toting stuff that was happening by often northern warlords in that first Loya Jirga, where men would say, we couldn't speak out because, there were people who were threatening us. And the women said, you know what, if they turned off our microphone, we could just shout. And that I found really interesting. That and again, I found in the women in my cooperative even, they're a lot more clear-cut about the situation than the men are. For example, they have not a lot of sympathy for civilian casualties in villages that have clearly been cooperating in the way that I described earlier with the Taliban. And the women say, you know what? They tell us we shouldn't have any truck with the government, and then when they get wounded, where do they come? They come to the government hospital. They come to our hospital. How dare they? They shouldn't be treated. That's literally what the women were saying about these civilian casualties. So I actually think that the women presence in the parliament has been very salutary. That's not to say that it may not be provoking a backlash. There is a mullah in Kandahar city who is taking a pretty interestingly radical stance because he is not supporting the so-called insurgency. He's criticizing the suicide bombings and all of this kind of thing, but he's also criticizing the government. And one of the things that he said a Friday that one of my cooperative members went to listen to him was, what kind of government is this? This is not, it doesn't say in the Quran that we can have women in parliament. This is not an Islamic government. It's not an appropriate government. So it's a very difficult issue. Ma'am, and then you. And have I been missing?
Hi, I'm Patricia Smith-Melton. I'm the Executive Director of Peace by Peace. And we work with women in about 50 different nations. In Afghanistan, we're working with the Afghan Women's Network, which is primarily in Kabul. Some of my questions are already asked, but I want to ask you, where do you see hope? And the other one, a little footnote to that, is, are you personally safe?
Thank you for asking. Do I see hope? I think human beings can be, we're supposed to be graced with this gray matter up here, but we're actually not very rational. And I have to be quite frank and tell you that what I'm doing, I don't believe that what I'm doing has any rational basis whatsoever. Because if I were to do a prognosis, I can't see this turning around. I've been watching this process. I mean, it's kind of broken the surface in the Western press in the last couple of months, but everything that's happening now in southern Afghanistan, I've been watching it arrive for the past 4.5 years. So, and I have not seen anything turn around in such a way. On the contrary, if anything, I almost feel like we may be reaching a tipping point. I mean, the fact that villages that I used to work in now, when I say, oh, could I buy your pomegranates? I used to buy your milk. You told me to buy fruit. I want to buy your pomegranates. And the village elder tells me, please don't come to my village. Not for me, but for him, because he and his villagers might be retaliated against because of my village. When you have people saying, please don't do me a favor, don't help me out, that's a really devastating situation. And the other situation is that highly qualified people are, again, saying, thanks very much, I'd rather not take a job in government. And those were the two things that might have been able to turn this around. The moral of this story, I probably shouldn't tell you the punchline, but it has to do with, you know, this old adage, if at first you don't succeed, try again. I think it's wrong. I think it's, even if you know you're not going to succeed, you have to try. We don't have the right to abandon this struggle. And the other thing, I mean, now I get to preach, right? The other thing I'd like to say is that look around. Take a look at the youth murder rate in Washington, D.C. How often do we think about that? I think there's Afghanistan in America. I think there's Afghanistan in a lot of different places. And I think it has to do with, again, I'm going to go back to the point I made in the beginning of this talk, it has to do with us versus them. It has to do with drawing lines of social inclusion and exclusion. And as soon as you draw those lines in that way, you plant the seeds of conflict. And I think it's our job to break those barriers down. I think there was another, against the wall. And have I been missing this side? Is there anyone who's been dying to ask a question on this side? Okay, so let me go there and then to you, sir.
Hello, Humaira Mukhtarzada from IFAS. 2 questions for you. First of all, I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your talk, but what made you go to Afghanistan in the first place and start such a venture? And I've forgotten my second question. So
okay. And you know what? I forgot to answer the question about my own security. And that's a complex question because let's say I don't live in daily fear. I really hate the sensation of fear. And so I just think that I decide that I'd rather not. So that means I'm actually not very courageous. A courageous person is somebody who is afraid and does something anyway. The person who, anyway. I take some precautions, and it was funny, I was in a taxi cab in New York City yesterday, and I caught myself rolling up the window. A person pushed some cart past or rode a bicycle past, and instinctively I put up the window because you drive around with your windows open and people can put grenades in them. And that's one of the things that has become a habit for me. I vary my routes and things like that, but I don't have guards, I don't have a barbed wire fence, I don't do that stuff, and I do drive around. And I think that 2 or 3 things, knock wood, have kept me alive thus far. One is that I feel like a member of the community. And I try to behave as much like a member of the community as I know how. That doesn't mean that I don't break a lot of taboos, but when I first arrived in Kandahar as a reporter, I just instinctively couldn't bring myself to stay in the hotel with all the rest of the journalists. And I had a friend, a contact, who was one of these militia guys, and he's great. And without really thinking about it, and he also, pulled my leg. He told me a lot of stuff that wasn't true, which I reported, but at least I quoted him on it. But I did ask him, you know, could you please find a place for me to stay? And so he says, yes, here, bring your car in. So we roar off in our convoy. I've got, you know, 3 trucks of gun-toting, you know, toughs on either side of us. And we go into a graveyard, and he deposits me in a house in the middle of the graveyard. And so I lived for the next 2 months with a family, with an extended family of Kandaharis. And they were totally regular folks. The brothers worked in decorating the bodies of trucks. The trucks have these incredibly fanciful decorations on them, and that was their job. And that's how I experienced Kandahar for the first 2 months. And I try to keep that kind of integration as much as I can with the community. I speak Pashto functionally, if not highly articulately. I run my cooperative in Pashto. No one speaks English. And I also think my loyalty has won some hearts. And the fact that it's not just journalists who do this parachute thing. It turns out to be the humanitarian community does it also. Also, Afghanistan is a retribution society. And I don't believe that once somebody has decided to kill you, that you can prevent it. This is a case in point. This man was the chief of police of Kabul and, you know, was a highly protected and highly alert person. And he was blown up in a mosque with 20 other people, and I think that he was the target of that attack. I don't think this was an accident. So the trick is, how do you persuade people not to decide to kill you? And what you have to do is project the idea that if you get killed, they'll get killed too. And so paradoxically, that means that I've actually not hidden the fact that I'm American, and I have not hidden the fact that I have interaction with high-level Americans. That I don't drive in American convoys, because that's about the most dangerous place you can be in Afghanistan. But I don't mind if locals see me driving on and off the U.S. base, because maybe the word will get out that I've got a predator, you know, flying around over my head. And but it also means, when I talk about integration in the community, it also means that people know that I have good friends among tribal elders. And I don't know, I'm just speculating, but I think this complex of things, knock wood, is what's kept me safe so far. So now we're back to your question, which was about how I got into this, and I'll do it quickly. But it has to do with, I was a reporter, and it just felt like Afghanistan was the place where this battle between the with us or against us team and the we are an interconnected world team with things to learn from and teach each other, that was going to be the battleground. And if I was going to start building bridges between the so-called, you know, irrevocably hostile Islam and West, Kandahar was the place to do it. Are you going to tell me that I have to shut up now?
No. I'm saying that our allotted hour is over, but if you're willing to take a couple more questions, I think you have a lot of people who would like to ask you questions.
There was one there, and then I suspect people may want to buy books, and I actually do have to get out of this building at about 5 of 1. So,
and the bookseller is here now. Why don't we
let's take one question, and then let's go outside to sign, or do you want me to sign here?
I think we can sign right here. People
okay, you guys go out and buy, and then bring them back to me. So, sir, right in front of me. Is that my telephone that's ringing? Okay. Is it? If it's not bothering anyone, then.
Mark Moore from the Wilson Center. You said you mentioned that you worked for a while for the brother of the president, and that so you had contacts at high levels. You also quoted, I think, a Kandahari telling you, in the daytime the government oppresses us, in the nighttime. So, what is your opinion of the president? It seems that the president is numb, or he's not. What is he trying to do to?
I don't get it. This is a person who deeply inspired me. I mean, he also had a lot to do with why I decided to leave reporting and stay in Afghanistan, is I felt like this guy, you know, this guy has inspired his entire country. He has really lit a path, and he's doomed. So we have to help him. That's how I felt in 2001. I mean, and I have to say I'm really disappointed with him. I don't think that he is personally venal or personally motivated by money or even necessarily power. I actually don't think, but that's not good enough, frankly. And I think that when you are presiding over the rape of your country, and that's what's happening, that you bear responsibility for that. And so I believe that that doesn't mean that there isn't some degree of shared responsibility. I don't want to put it all on him. It is certainly true that the United States government didn't make it easy for him to remove these warlords from power and stuff like that. But maybe I'm a big mouth, but in his place, I would have gotten up and said, excuse me, I am the president of a sovereign nation, and I want to fire the following 6 governors. And if that's not okay with you, that's tough, you know? And if it's really not okay with you, I resign. And he never had, and he would have had the backing of the Afghan people to do that. And I don't believe he ever did it. And, you know, when I saw him 3 weeks ago, I said, look, you have to tackle this thing. And I've also been bossing around the current Kandahar governor and saying the same thing and saying, I believe what you need to do is come up with a plan, a really radical plan to eradicate corruption from Kandahar province. And here's how I think you ought to go about doing it. And what I would do if I were in his position is use some of the $5 to $8 million a month that comes into Kandahar in customs, which is disappearing in all kinds of directions that nobody is really tracking, and raise the salaries of civil servants to a living wage. If you don't want to do that, then you put a box in every public office with a poster on the wall that says, you know what, there's going to be a surcharge for each, official act is what the French call it. I don't know what we call it in English. But, you know, for example, I need to deposit money in the National Bank, and I have like 5 different receipts that, you know, parts of that money go in 5 different directions. So for the writing out of each one of those receipts, the official gets 10 Afghanis, let's say. And I put that 10 Afghanis in the box, and that goes to raise his salary. Then you pillory the guy who's caught extorting bribes. Once you get the salary up to a level that somebody can live on, and I'm not saying you murder them or you torture them, I'm saying that you concoct a punishment that brings down a lot of public shame on that person. And you fire them and things like that. And I put this before the governor, and he came up with 6 reasons why he can't do this. And there are, you know, all sorts of reasons. But one reasonable one on his list was, you know what, if I fire someone for corruption, he's going to go to President Karzai and get himself reinstated. And that's happened. So what I said when I saw President Karzai is, here's what I advise the governor to do. If he comes to you with this plan, you have to back him up. What President Karzai said is, I mean, this is all in the form of conversation among friends and things like that. But what President Karzai told me was, don't worry about it, Sarah. I've just appointed a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And, you know, he's a great guy, and we're going to work on this issue this way. And it's going to take a while for it all to trickle down. So not knowing anything about Kabul politics, I said, well, that's great, Mr. President. You know, I'm delighted to, you know. So later I find out that it's the parliament that rammed this guy down Karzai's throat. And this goes back to your question. I'm angry at him for lying to me. How dare he take credit for that appointment when he fought against it? So I have a really hard time, as much as I would like to defend the guy, and as much as I'm not sure who would be better, and that's the big problem for Afghanistan, I don't like being lied to, and I don't think that's the way to run a government. Thank you so much for coming, for being so numerous, and for your absolutely fabulous questions. And I'm around for another 20 minutes.
Sarah, we're delighted to have you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Hala Asfandiari. Buy a book. The bookseller is out there now, and Sarah will sign it for you.